Hi, I'm Shelley and today I'll be talking to you about embossing. Embossing creates a 3D raised surface on selected areas of a printed design. Embossing is a cost-effective and simple way to enhance printed materials. Many different materials can be embossed, and the process and tools used are different depending on the materials. Embossing is a simple and straightforward process. It works by placing a sheet of paper between a female die with a design etched into it and a male counter die. When the two dies are pushed together, it creates a raised impression on the paper and the embossed design is created. Embossing can be done either with or without heat. For designs that have greater detail, embossing with heat is recommended. Heat relaxes the fibers of the paper and allows the paper to mold the dies more effectively. There are different depths that can be chosen for embossing. The deeper the depth, the higher the chance there is of the paper ripping during the embossing process. Paper stock choice will produce different results. Debossing is the opposite of embossing and can be used to create an engraved look. To deboss, the dies are switched so that the female die is at the bottom and the male die is at the top, creating a depressed image. There are typically three types of presses that are used for embossing: the clamshell press, straight stamp press, and roll press. The clamshell press is the most popular of the presses. It is easy to switch dies and change the setup, so these presses are typically used for smaller runs. It works by applying pressure to the paper between the male and female dies. The machine resembles a clamshell, where its name derived. The straight stamp press feeds the paper through the press, pressing the die straight down. With the paper being fed through the machine, these presses are much faster than the clamshell presses. The setup times for these machines is longer, so these presses are used for larger runs. The roll press is the fastest of the three presses. Paper is fed between rollers with a die mounted on them, and the pressure from the rollers creates the embossed impression onto the paper. The dies for the roll presses are more expensive and the setup time is much longer, so it's only used for very large print runs. Blind embossing is embossing without any foiling, ink, or other embellishments. It is the natural state of an embossed design. Single level embossing is when a design is embossed to only one level. This is the cheapest and most simple embossing technique. For single level embossing, a copper or magnesium die can be chosen. Magnesium is cheapest, but is a soft metal and is easily destroyed. It is only good for small runs of 5,000 to 10,000 impressions before the die is destroyed. Magnesium dies can also be destroyed by just one misfeed in the press. Copper is more expensive, but is stronger and is rated for 100,000 impressions. Multi-level embossing is an embossed design with more than one level. It changes the surface of the paper at many different levels. The dies for multi-level embossing can be engraved by a machine. Typically, brass is used for multi-level embossing. Brass is the strongest of all the metals used for embossing and lasts more than 100,000 impressions. It can be quite expensive, costing 2 to 3 times more than magnesium or copper. It is used for multi-level embossing as a deeper etch can be achieved and it gives a higher definition finish. Beveled edge embossing is embossing with a bevel on the edge of the design, typically between 30 to 60 degrees. Deep dies must have a beveled edge to stop the die splitting through the paper. The greater the angle becomes, the more prominent the illusion of depth becomes. Also known as a roof emboss, this emboss uses 3 V-shapes, with 2 V-shapes at the end of the emboss and a larger V connecting them. A textured die emboss is a single level emboss with an etched texture. This type of emboss is typically used to create detailed, natural textures. It is best used for designs that do not intend on looking smooth and refined. Also known as dome die embossing, it creates a rounded, dome shape in the paper design. It is mostly used for typographical effects and logos. Sculptured die embossing consists of a die that is sculpted by hand. Sculptured dies are highly detailed and have many levels of angles, curves, and depths. These dies are typically made of brass. This is the most expensive form of embossing as the die needs to be carved by hand. Registered embossing is when embossing is used in conjunction with another element such as foil, ink, punching, or a second embossed image. When using embossing with ink, the ink image is printed first and the embossing is done afterward. It is important that the element and the die line up correctly. Embossing can be used in conjunction with several different finishes including foiling, spot UV, and glazing. As part of the Embellishments Group, we chose to produce artwork for the Last Goodbye closing night event. We each produced a book for the event using our respective embellishments. The design features two hands slipping away from each other, representing the themes discussed in the event. Both the event name and holding hands are embossed. This will require registration embossing to make sure all of the elements align correctly. To set up a file for embossing, a separate layer must be made in the file. Depending on your printing company, choose either a black or a spot color for the embossed area. Make sure the black or spot color is set to overprint to ensure it doesn't knock out any colors below it. This is what your print-ready file will look like with color separations.